Before elephants crossed the Alps, before Rome trembled, this is the war that created Hannibal. This was no rebellion, it was a reckoning. Echoes of the past. They say history remembers the victors, but some stories are buried beneath the silence of the defeated. After 20 years of brutal war with Rome, Carthage had lost. Its empire was wounded, its armies disbanded, and its treasury drained. But peace did not bring relief. It brought betrayal. 20,000 foreign mercenaries, men who had bled for Carthage, demanded the pay they were promised. The city hesitated. The hesitation became a spark. That spark became an inferno. Led by two outlaws, the mercenaries turned their weapons on their former masters. Towns rose in rebellion. 70,000 joined them. What followed was not a war, it was a massacre. And in the shadows of this forgotten conflict stood one man, a father with a vision, a warrior shaped by defeat, driven by vengeance. His name was Hamilcar Barca, and from the ashes of this chaos, he would raise a son, a boy who would one day swear eternal hatred to Rome. This is the war that created Hannibal. In 241 BC, the First Punic War ended, and with it, Carthage's grip on Sicily. Rome emerged victorious, but it was a victory bought in blood, debt, and bitterness. Carthage, once the richest maritime empire in the Western Mediterranean, was humiliated. The war had drained its treasury, crippled its fleet, and forced it to pay a massive indemnity to Rome. But while diplomats signed the treaty, 20,000 mercenaries who had fought Carthage's battles on Sicily waited to be paid. These were not Carthaginian citizens. They were hardened veterans from Africa, Gaul, Iberia, and Greece. They had no loyalty to the Carthaginian Senate, only to their gold. And Carthage, exhausted and broke, stalled. What began as a delay became a crisis. When the mercenaries marched on the city, demanding their wages, Carthage tried to negotiate. But it was too late. The tension snapped. Under the leadership of Spendius and Matho, the mercenaries rebelled. They declared war, not just on Carthage, but on everything it represented. Across North Africa, the oppressed towns and subject peoples rose up. Farmers, exiles, and former allies joined the revolt. The rebellion exploded into what would be called the Truceless War, a conflict with no rules, no mercy, and no forgiveness. Carthage's armies faltered, its generals bickered, its people, still reeling from defeat, now faced destruction from within. And it was in this moment of desperation that one name would return to the front lines. Not a politician, not a nobleman, but a soldier of fire and iron. Hamilcar Barca. He had fought in Sicily, he had tasted defeat, and now he returned not to serve Carthage, but to save it. Because Hamilcar understood something that the elders in the Senate did not. Rome was not the end of their problems, it was only the beginning. 240 BC. Carthage stood on the edge of ruin. Its once glorious legions had been scattered, its generals were paralyzed by indecision, and outside its walls, a storm was rising. What began as a wage dispute had now become an existential war. The mercenaries, once disciplined soldiers, had transformed into a fanatical, vengeful force. Under Spendius and Matho, they unleashed a campaign of terror, laying siege to Carthaginian cities, cutting supply lines, and rallying tens of thousands of angry Africans to their side. Carthage, desperate, turned to a name many feared, and many more resented: Hamilcar Barca. He was no politician. He had clashed with the Senate, challenged its cowardice, and spoken openly of their failures. But he had done what few others had: held back the Romans in Sicily for years, against impossible odds. He was a soldier of principle and pride, and now Carthage gave him partial command. Just enough authority to be blamed if he failed, but not enough to win. Still, Hamilcar did what he always had. He acted. He restructured the remnants of the Carthaginian army, drilled them mercilessly, forged new alliances, and marched straight into the heart of the rebellion. But he came not with hatred, at least not at first. He offered mercy. To the rebels he sent envoys. He offered peace, amnesty, a chance to return to order. Some hesitated. Some even considered laying down their arms, but Spendius would not allow it. He knew Hamilcar was dangerous, not just with a sword, but with words. If the rebellion splintered, they were doomed. So he sent a message, a brutal, irreversible message. 700 Carthaginian prisoners were taken, noblemen, officers, envoys, and tortured to death. Publicly, slowly. Their screams echoed across the plains, their mutilated bodies cast into pits. From that moment on, there would be no peace. The rules of war were shattered. The lines between soldier and butcher, rebel and warlord, dissolved. This was no longer a rebellion. It was a truceless war, a war of vengeance, of annihilation. And in that fire, Hamilcar would be forged into something far more than a general. He would become a symbol of survival, of resistance, of everything Carthage had left. And somewhere in the distance, a young boy watched. His name was Hannibal, and he would never forget what men do when there is no truce. Hamilcar Barca rode into war with eyes that had seen defeat, but with a will forged in something far stronger: vengeance. He knew this wasn't just a battle for Carthage. It was a reckoning. The rebel armies now controlled most of the Carthaginian heartland. Cities had fallen. Supplies had been cut off. The roads were soaked in blood, and even Carthage itself trembled behind its walls. But Hamilcar was relentless. With a corps of loyal troops, he began a brutal campaign of maneuver warfare. He didn't just confront the rebels. He hunted them. He ambushed supply trains. He cut off water sources. He struck by night, vanished by morning. His soldiers called him the Lion of Carthage, not for his roar, but for his precision. And then he made a gamble. A rebel force, vastly superior in number, had taken position along the Bagradas River. Hamilcar saw an opening, not through strength, but through terrain. He led his troops across a treacherous mountain pass at night, encircling the enemy without being seen. At dawn, the trap was sprung. The rebel camp fell into chaos. Panic turned to slaughter. Thousands were killed, the rest scattered. It was Hamilcar's first decisive victory, and Carthage, watching from afar, breathed again. But mercy was no longer part of the plan. After Spendius's massacre of prisoners, this had become a war of absolutes. Hamilcar began taking no captives. Rebels were executed. Towns that harbored them were razed. The message was clear. There would be no second chances. Yet beneath the iron discipline, something else stirred. something older, deeper. Each victory Hamilcar claimed wasn't just for Carthage, it was personal. This war had made him more than a commander. It had made him a father of an idea. With him rode a boy, still in his youth, sharp-eyed, silent, absorbing every lesson, watching every act of strategy, every moment of cruelty, every oath sworn and broken. Hannibal. To the Carthaginian elites, the boy was just a general's son, but to Hamilcar, he was the future, not merely of his bloodline, but of vengeance itself. This war, soaked in betrayal and rage, would become the foundation of everything Hannibal would believe. The gods, it seemed, had not forgotten Carthage, and as the war dragged on, Hamilcar would push deeper, burning a path through rebel strongholds. Victory, however, would come at a cost, because in a war with no truce, even triumph leaves scars. The rebels had lost ground, but not resolve. And Spendius, still alive, still dangerous, was preparing one final act of defiance. The fire had been lit, and Hamilcar, willingly or not, was becoming its keeper. By 238 BC, the Truceless War had become more than a rebellion. It was a sickness, devouring Carthage from within. A war without mercy, without end, where cruelty was currency and death was never swift. But Hamilcar Barca had learned its language. Spendius, once a slave, now a warlord soaked in blood, had fled south with the shattered remnants of the rebel army. Their last hope, the fortified town of Leptis Parva. Here, amidst the dust-choked plains, he prepared for a final stand. Hamilcar saw the opportunity, not just to win the war, but to erase the rebellion from history itself. He marched his army across a desolate stretch of North Africa, sun blazing, supply lines stretched thin, morale fraying. But he kept them moving, because he knew one decisive blow could end it all. As Carthage held its breath, the two forces met near the Gulf of Gabes. The rebels, over 20,000 strong, dug in. They built trenches, ramparts, and wooden stakes. But they lacked one thing: unity. Their leadership was fractured. Their faith in victory had rotted away, replaced by desperation. And Hamilcar, he had no intention of offering terms. At dawn, he launched a full assault. Infantry from the front, cavalry from the flanks, and a hidden detachment sweeping around the enemy rear. It was a masterclass in battlefield geometry. Chaos erupted. The rebels, caught in their own fortifications, began to collapse inward. They tried to flee, but Hamilcar had anticipated it. His men closed the exits, forcing thousands into a narrow trench originally dug as a defensive line. Now it became a grave. Screams filled the air as Carthaginian soldiers pushed them back, cut them down, buried them beneath blood and soil. It would later be known, whispered in horror, as the Axe Trench. Spendius himself was captured alive. Hamilcar had waited for this moment. The man who had tortured his envoys, mocked his mercy, and turned war into butchery, would now face justice. But justice in this war was never clean. Spendius and the remaining rebel leaders were nailed to wooden crosses along the roads leading back to Carthage, their corpses left to rot, a warning etched in flesh. The rebellion was over. Carthage had won, but at a cost deeper than silver or soldiers. Its lands were scorched, its people were haunted. Trust between the ruling elite and its armies had been shattered. And Hamilcar himself? He had become a man few recognized, part general, part executioner, part legend. Yet in his shadow walked the next chapter of history. Hannibal, now a young boy hardened by years of war, had seen the face of total defeat and the price of total victory. He had watched cities burn, men scream, gods fall silent. And on the day of Carthage's final triumph, it is said Hamilcar took his son aside. He led him to the altar of Baal Hammon, the god of fire and war. And there, beneath the blood-stained sky, he made the boy swear an oath, never to be a friend of Rome. It was not policy, it was not politics. It was a curse passed down in fire, and the world would remember it, because this forgotten war had not only saved Carthage, it had created the man who would nearly destroy Rome. The war was over, but Carthage did not celebrate. There were no parades, no triumphs, only silence, and the heavy weight of what had been done. The Truceless War had cost Carthage more than it could afford. Entire regions had been depopulated. Its trade routes had withered. Its allies had turned fearful, and its enemies, watching from across the sea, had taken note. In Rome, senators saw an exhausted rival. But more than that, they saw an opportunity. As Carthage attempted to reclaim Sardinia, an island lost to mutiny, not conquest, Rome issued an ultimatum: hand over Sardinia and Corsica, and pay another crushing indemnity. It was blackmail. Carthage, desperate to rebuild, had no choice but to submit. It would not forget. Inside the city's walls, power began to shift. Hamilcar Barca, no longer just a general, emerged as the true guardian of Carthage's future. But he no longer believed in the old republic. He believed in something more pragmatic, more brutal: empire. To achieve it, he needed a new foundation, far from Roman reach. And so, in 237 BC, he led his veterans and his son westward, across the sea, to Iberia. There, amid mountains rich in silver and tribes waiting to be conquered, Hamilcar began to forge something new: a war machine, loyal to his house alone. He ruled like a king in all but name, and the boy, Hannibal, learned in his father's shadow: tactics, languages, diplomacy, hate. Hate not born from childish prejudice, but from memory. Memory of crosses lining the roads, of men torn apart by ideals, of oaths sealed in blood. From the ashes of the forgotten war, a future had been cast. One that would march elephants across the Alps. One that would lay siege to Rome's very soul. But that is another story, and it began with silence. The silence after a war that history tried to forget. History remembers the great wars, the clash at Cannae, the siege of Rome, the elephants in the Alps. But few remember the war that made it all possible. The Truceless War didn't end with victory. It ended with a vow. A child stood before his father, blood still fresh on the sand, and swore never to be a friend to Rome. That child would become Hannibal, the man who nearly brought the Republic to its knees. This was no mere rebellion. It was a crucible, one that forged a dynasty, reshaped a civilization, and lit a fire that would burn for decades. So next time you hear Hannibal's name, remember where he came from. Not from glory, but from blood, from betrayal, from silence. Now it's your turn. Have you ever heard of this war before? What if Carthage had crushed Rome in the Second Punic War? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's rewrite history together. And if you want more stories like this, forgotten wars, legendary oaths, ancient secrets, like, subscribe to Echoes of the Past. Because history doesn't just repeat, sometimes it waits to be remembered.